How are we doing today, guys? So today we're going to be talking about the box jump and more specifically about power output and related to the box jump. So we're not talking about doing repetitive ones, we're talking about singular efforts here. So when we're talking about box jump and generating force, the target should be to create as much vertical oscillation or as much height in the hip as humanly possible. The more height in the hip that we can create, the better that you're going to be able to generate force, better that you're going to be able to generate height on the pitch. So if I jump up, I can actually jump and land without my hip doing anything. That's just my leg pulling up. It's not actually creating a jump. So if I do a jump and I jump here, my hip actually traveled down. I had a negative, I dropped. I didn't actually jump high compared to coming into that where my hip orientated vertically. So when we're talking about power output, we're talking about vertical hip oscillation. So what I want you guys thinking about is creating a stretch reflex. So a stretch reflex is a change in direction which is going to create a lengthening of the muscle, which the muscle will then respond by contracting and creating a powerful kickback. So what I want you thinking about is setting yourself up, creating length, and even coming up into the toes. Some people will prefer to come onto the heels so they're not stable on their toes. That's okay. Come up to the toes, you're going to drive downwards with everything you have. Arms are going to swing down, torso is going to travel down. You're going to create a lengthening through the knees and through the hips. From there, you're going to try and change direction aggressively and snap back up into triple extension, utilizing the arms to drive yourself upwards. So if I create that action, feet should be directly under hips, as that's going to be where you're primarily going to be jumping, maybe a fraction wider. From there, up, snap down, to then snap back up. Make sense? You're looking to create late knee extension as well as earlier hips, because a lot of people will come through and will go knees first, then hips, and will create a hip orientated action, which is good for horizontal jumping, but it's not good for vertical jumping. So late knees, same thing again, down, snap, and catch. Make sense? So obviously I can land pretty much straight legged on that. I'd probably flip up to the next box. So if you're doing that action, but you're only catching, and you're only catching about here, and then having to stand out of it, then you probably need to drop the box height or jump a little bit harder to maximize that. So a big thing with box jumps is talking about creating intent. You have to want to go higher. It's not just about making the target. We want to be trying to create height and generate as much force as humanly possible. So that's all about mentality, and it's quite important to generate enough to create the correct mentality to generate height. So running over those cues, feet underneath hips. You want to be thinking about the whole foot being on the ground, not outside or inside, whole foot on the ground. Feet are straight, that way you create hip extension, because the hip's going to extend better in internal rotation versus external rotation. From there, we want to be trying to create extension to then drop down into our drop position, and it should be balanced in that bottom position in terms of should be stacked over the feet. From there, you're going to change directions quickly and aggressively to create a fast knee extension and hip extension, ideally a late knee extension, to then jump up onto the box to get as much height of the hip as humanly possible. From there, the other thing that we want to talk about is landing. So a depth drop. Now, different types of depth drops can be done depending on what we're trying to look for. So if I drop off this box and I drop and I absorb, I'm trying to kill force, I'm trying to decelerate. And what you would have noticed there is I'm trying to absorb into the ground, which is good. However, it's not necessarily good for all things, because quite often in sport we're trying to recoil, change the directions. Running is a recoil-based movement. If we're trying to land and then go again, or land and then accelerate. So learning how to absorb force is one thing, but learning how to absorb and go again and create that stretch reflex is quite another. So if we're doing a drop jump where we're trying to recoil, that's where you drop off and you'd try and spend as little time on the ground as possible. Obviously you can add in jumps horizontally, laterally, vertically, etc., depending on what you're trying to do. Now, when you're trying to jump off the ground, spend little time as possible on the ground, your target should be trying to keep the toes up, not point them down. If you land, and you land with your toe pointed down, there's a lot of space there to create any sort of tension onto your Achilles. which means you're not going to get any spring and bounce out of it. So deliberately landing with heels hovering just off the ground, so that way you can create that spring straight off the ground, is quite beneficial, rather than landing toes down. Having said that, if you land with toes down and you're trying to absorb into the ground and you kind of kill force, that's quite a beneficial position. So think about the shape that you're hitting and the position that you're trying to hit when you're doing a depth drop. So that's our box jump and our depth drop. Obviously these things can be repeated on a single leg. So if I was to do a single leg box jump, I'd set myself up exactly the same way. Most people will probably have to stay flat-footed here rather than coming up onto the toe. You'd still create your stretch reflex, you'd still create your extension, and you'd still land on the box, ideally with the same leg. So if I come through, I'm going to drop down and snap, and I'm going to land. I had to use my other foot to create my balance, but I created maximal hip orientation to get as high as possible. And then if I was dropping down, again, I'm going to absorb this one, but I could absorb, or I could, I could spring back up out of that. So if I step down, I'm going to drop off the same foot that I'm going to land on, absorb at the bottom. Make sense? Now when you're creating absorption, I overbalance a little bit there, but you're looking to create hip elevation and you're looking to create hip being square. Same goes for when you're actually trying to do the jump, and you actually want to utilize the other leg as well. The other leg creates momentum and allows you to create more force and a higher jump with the action itself. So if I come through, as I'm coming through that action, you'll see that the other leg is going to move and create actions for me. Same thing when I come down. If I start with it up, I can use it to absorb into the movement to kill some of my action. So thinking about that. Now, in terms of the hip position, this is all controlled by the glute and the adductor, the inside of the leg. They're going to work together to create elevation and drop of the hip. We want to be trying to utilize that elevation and that drop to be able to control the action that's going on in the movement. So think about creating stability by trying to drive through the ground, and think about trying to create stability by elevating the hip, which is also going to allow you to create better hip extension as well as knee extension. So same thing again, if I go again, if I drop down, change direction, pop, I can stabilize that, and you would have seen a little bit of movement through the other leg. If I drop down again, I'm going to start with this leg high, that way I can absorb as I go down to the bottom. I'm going to hop off, absorb, to be able to control that action. Again, a lot more balance in both of those movements. So that's what we want to be thinking about, that's the actions we want to be going through, and the intent that we want to be thinking about when we're creating a box jump, both bilaterally and unilaterally. If you've got any questions, flick us a message. Thanks for watching.